Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, for Mayadeen TV, here in the tropical splendor on the equator, here in the center, the museums and culture quarter of the Venezuelan capital. Everything is quiet now after yesterday's extraordinary tumult when millions of people were on the streets of the capital in support of the election campaign of the ruling president, Hugo Chavez. Comandante Chavez has been in power here in Venezuela for 14 years, action-packed, controversial years in which many changes have occurred in this society. Some changes are welcomed by the vast majority of the people. Other changes are more divisive. This election matters, first of all, of course, for Venezuelans. Secondly, for all of the Americas, North and South. But it also matters for the Arab world, for obvious reasons. President Hugo Chavez has been a staunch supporter of the Palestinian people, an inveterate opponent of the Zionist state of Israel, and he has opposed American imperial projects across the Arab world all of the 14 years that he's been in power. When bombs were raining down on the Palestinian people in Gaza during Operation Cast Lead, only one country in the entire world expelled the Israeli ambassador from the capital, and that was here in Caracas, in Venezuela, and as a result of a decision made by Hugo Chavez. So his opponent, not unnaturally, has tilted in the other direction. He's strongly supported by Israel and by pro-Israel elements in the United States. And of course, it goes without saying, with his neoliberal economics, his neocon approach to politics, he's favored in Miami, where all the emigres have congregated, as well as in the United States capital of Washington, D.C. So it's an election with many consequences, not just for Venezuelans, but for the world, which is why the city is filled with international visitors and with media from all over the world. This is not just an ordinary election in Latin America, and Hugo Chavez is very definitely not just an ordinary man. Kalima Horra, of course, means free word, and there have been many millions of free words exchanged in this extraordinary election campaign. This is a very highly polarized political system. This is a system where President Chavez speaks for the poor, for the working people, and for the young, and his opponent Capriles speaks for the rest, and the rest are the rich. This system, where the rich own huge numbers of private television stations and private newspapers and many other means of communication, are a strange feature of what Fox News continues to call a dictatorship. In fact, Jimmy Carter said this has been one of the freest and fairest presidential election campaigns that he has ever witnessed, and he has witnessed many. Now, what's the gripe of the rich? Well, it's simple. Before Hugo Chavez 14 years ago, the money that Venezuela earns from its enormous oil and gas reserves went almost exclusively to the rich. There was no public realm. The expenditure on housing, on health, and on education for the poor masses in the country was very small indeed. And if you were born poor in Venezuela before Chavez, you were guaranteed a life with little education and little hope and little prospect. All of that has changed. The government seizes, you might say, a very substantial portion of Venezuela's oil wealth, and it redistributes it across the poor barrios in improving the health conditions and, above all, the education of the people. Venezuela has opened 22 new universities in Hugo Chavez's 14 years in power. It's the 5th largest student body in the entire world, and yet there's only 28 million people here in this country. 98% of Venezuelans now eat 3 meals a day, where before the poor very often went to sleep hungry. And the 2% that remain are eating at least 2 meals a day. Housing, everyone can see around the big cities in Venezuela, these barrios, these slum areas. usually built on a hillside and very likely to succumb to landslides and other natural disasters, leaving many thousands dead and hundreds of thousands homeless on a regular basis. President Chavez has promised that in this coming election period, in this coming presidency, that by the end of it, every Venezuelan in the country will live in a dignified house. Now, none of that is to say that Chavez has not made any mistakes. Sometimes his harsh class against class rhetoric alienates people in the country and indeed without the country. Sometimes the corruption which exists in every country and definitely exists here has degraded his personal popularity. People say Chavez is good, but the people around him are not always so good. It's not to say that state ownership of large sectors of the economy does not bring with it other problems. There is no doubt that a state ownership can sometimes mean that the people involved in the enterprise don't necessarily work for the enterprise because they know that their money is coming at the end of the month, whether or not the performance and the productivity is good. Even worse from the standpoint of the United States, not only is Hugo Chavez strongly in favor of independence for Venezuela from the United States of America, but he's deeply interested in making Latin American unity. This is something that may be of interest in the Arab world because, you see, Chavez believes that as Latin America, with the exception of Brazil, all speak the same language and all have essentially the same set of backgrounds, some indigenous, some black people who were brought to South America as part of the slave trade, and of course some who are descendants of the Spanish colonialists themselves. And President Chavez is actually a mixture of all three. He's a mixture of indigenous Indian, of black, and of white Spanish descent. He wants to unify Latin America, and as such, he's invested a very considerable sum of Venezuela's money in Latin American institutions. He's set up, for example, a Latin American television network called Telesur. He's invested in the University of the South, University of the Sur. He has invested in Bank of the Sur. He has all the time looked out for ways that he can bring the peoples of Latin America together. And of course, if they come together and are thereby stronger, the United States in this zero-sum game is considerably weaker. So Chavez has been a very considerable thorn in the side of the United States in Latin America, in the Americas. But when you look at the kind of stance he's taken on American foreign policy further abroad, well, you can see the kind of confrontation that must necessarily be created by the fact that you've got a president in Latin America of a rich and populous country which is standing, for example, firmly with the Arabs and against Israel and American policy in the region. President Chavez strongly opposed the war against Libya. He strongly opposes the foreign intervention in Syria. He strongly opposes the settler state of Israel, all of which bring him into sharp contradiction with the United States of America, and incidentally earn him the loyalty of at least 80% of the Arabs living in Venezuela, who are very considerable in number indeed. And most of them have done very well. Some of them are fantastically rich. They would normally be against Chavez on purely economic political grounds. But because of Chavez's foreign policy stand with the Arabs against the United States and against Israel, the vast majority of Arabs in Venezuela are with the president, and particularly the young Arabs, who form a very militant and active part of his formation, which we saw and you saw on the news on Mayadeen, is very numerous indeed. I must tell you, as a politician myself, having been 40 years or more in politics, it is just inconceivable anywhere else in the world that a president who's been in power for 14 years can still move millions upon millions of people onto the streets, wearing their red shirts, singing his name and pledging their undying support, when there's no shortage of people trying to persuade them to do otherwise. That's why this election is such an important one. It's why there's so much world attention in it. It's why there's a constant carping criticism in the right wing as well as the so-called liberal press about problems here in Venezuela, which clearly exist. It's why the world is waiting for the result. On Sunday, will Hugo Chavez make it 8-0 in his series of extraordinary electoral and referenda victories? Or will the great powerhouse, this bull, this real force of nature, will he finally be brought to his knees? The cancer didn't do it last year. Will the election do it this year? That's the question. Now, I told you that there were many Arabs in Venezuela, and one of them, hearing that Mayadeen was in town, has come down to this beautiful arena here, and I've no doubt he has a question or two for me. I'll let him introduce himself.
Hello. ماريو الأسمر من لبنان، فنزويلي من أصل لبناني. بحب أسأل سعادة النايب سؤالين. أول سؤال، نحن كلنا العرب بفنزويلا ندعم الرئيس تشافي وعم ندعمه بالحملة، وإن شاء الله إذا الله بيريد ينجح بالانتخابات. بس في حال الشعب الفنزويلي خذلوا للرئيس تشافي، شو بتظن حضرتك سعادة النايب إنه بده يصير بفنزويلا بالشعب الفنزويلي وبعلاقة فنزويلا مع العرب، الحكومة الفنزويلية مع العرب؟ السؤال الثاني عن الحرب بسوريا، شو بتظن سعادتك في حال راح نظام بشار الأسد في خطر على الوجود المسيحي بالشرق وخصوصا بلبنان؟
Well, actually, those two questions neatly illustrate the point I made earlier. Number one, that most of the Arab Venezuelans, and particularly the young Arab Venezuelans, are strongly behind President Hugo Chavez, and for reasons which you might think obvious. And secondly, that though they're Venezuelan, they're still Arabs and are still vitally interested in what's going on in their area of origin, the issues that are literally burning part, at least for now, of the Arab world. Well, look, the first question can't really be answered exactly, because even if President Chavez were to lose, he would still exist and his movement would still exist, and they would be a powerful opposition, and they would resist any attempts made by a victorious opposition leader to dismantle and unravel the gains of the Venezuelan revolution. But let's, for argument's sake, imagine that Capriles is the president after Sunday. I don't myself think that that will happen. But if it were to happen, there are some obvious things that Capriles would immediately attempt to do. The first is to drastically reduce the role of the state and the public sector in the Venezuelan economy, to make it just another American-style free enterprise economy where if you've got money, you can buy goods and services. If you don't have money, well, you can starve and remain ignorant in your barrio with no schooling, and if you fall sick, you'd have very little chance of finding proper health care. So there would be an immediate assault on the living standards of the poor in Venezuela, and that, of course, would be resisted. There's no way that President Capriles, were that ever to happen, is going to be investing on free cable cars to bring the poor down from the barrios into the center of the city, or investing in more and more new universities, or building hundreds of thousands of new houses for poor people who can't afford to buy houses. There's no way that the neoliberal economics of Capriles would allow him to do that. And of course, internationally, the consequences would be even more dramatically different, because immediately such a presidency would seek to make up its relations with Washington, which effectively means allowing Washington back into Venezuela to call the shots, to make important decisions, or at least heavily influence important decisions, in the way, for example, that the United States does in Colombia, the next door country here already. Colombia is probably, along with Chile, the last of the countries in Latin America that take orders from Washington. Well, Venezuela under Capriles would begin to be another Latin American country taking orders from Washington. Capriles has already said that he would review almost all, with the exception of China, interestingly, almost all of President Chavez's international alliances. He would review the relations with Russia, for example. He would review the relations with Iran. He would review the relations with the Arab world and would tilt the country's foreign policy in favor of Israel. He's already said so. Capriles is openly a supporter of Israel, and Israel is openly a supporter of him. So you can see the picture that would begin to emerge, which of course helps to explain why anti-imperialist people all over the world are very much hoping that President Chavez wins again on Sunday, and why Arab Venezuelans in particular are vitally interested in a Chavez victory. The second of your questions is easy to answer, because we don't have to look in the crystal ball to see the future. We can read the book of what happened in Iraq. Iraq had the oldest Christian population anywhere in the world. Where is it now? It's everywhere except Iraq. The churches were burned, the priests were murdered, even senior clerics were murdered. Massacres took place on the altar, during the Mass, on Sundays, on holy days, and of the same kind of Islamist fanatic extremists who were active in Iraq against the Christian population were to come to power in Syria, as they have done, for example, in parts at least of Libya, you can easily see the consequences. I believe that such a lurch to extremism in Syria would have profound implications for the Christian population. First in Syria, which is, I don't have to tell you, the best protected, most honored Christian population anywhere in the Arab world. Christians are a vital part of Syrian society, and they are terrified at the prospect of these Al-Qaeda type elements, these Libyan fighting group elements coming to power in Syria. So the consequences for Christians in Syria would be disastrous. And it's impossible to believe that that would not knock on into Lebanon. If Syria catches a cold, people start sneezing in Lebanon, and vice versa, because these are fraternal countries joined forever at the hip, and events in one can only profoundly affect the situation in another. So there are many reasons for hoping that these fanatic extremists do not triumph in Syria. There are many reasons for hoping that Al-Qaeda does not come to rule Damascus. But one of them, definitely, is the whole future of relations between religions and sects within religions. Because, of course, one of the possibilities of what I describe as Sykes-Picot 2 is that we break up Syria and we break up Lebanon into sectarian, confessional emirates, which, of course, you don't need to be a genius to work out, would very quickly be set one against the other, spend as much time at each other's throats as the imperial powers could encourage them to do, and we could have a recipe for endless bitterness, hatred, and maybe even conflict, maybe even war. So I'm against the victory of these fanatic extremists for many reasons, but one of those reasons is that I want to preserve what is precious, the good relations that existed between Muslims and Christians in the Arab world for a millennium, and which have been divided and split and torn asunder as a deliberate policy of divide and rule by the big powers. When the Crusaders left, they were hoping that Arab Christians and Arab Muslims would never get along together, but they did. Until Zionism came to Palestine, Muslims and Christians lived happily side by side. And I believe that in what I describe as Bilad al-Sham, the old area, pre-Sykes-Picot, where everyone lived together in harmony for the most part, will be preserved. So I'm very worried about the consequences for the Christians in Syria and Lebanon if this war that's now raging were to end with a victory for the adherents of Osama bin Laden. Now, that question is just a sample of what I think exists out there in the streets of Caracas. So it's getting dark now. I think I'll be out and about in the morning finding more questions like Mario's. This is George Galloway, Kalima Horra for Mayadeen TV. Welcome back to this very special edition of Kalima Horra on Mayadeen television with me, George Galloway. Still here in the tropical splendor of Caracas, Venezuela, on the equator. It's been pretty hot here politically over these last few weeks and months, but all is admirably quiet now as the public contemplate how they're going to vote when the polling stations open at 6 o'clock in the morning just tomorrow. Everything is quiet because electioneering is banned for the last 2 days here in Venezuela, and that's probably a good thing because temperatures were very high with the rival rallies and the rhetoric flying between both camps, left and right, in the run-up to polling day. On the 7th of October, Venezuela will decide, and it will decide soberly. As a matter of interest, the sale of all alcohol is banned in Venezuela for 48 hours before voting and 24 hours after voting. So whatever tempers are aroused, at least they're not alcohol fueled. Now, the whole world is watching this election. It's not just a normal South American presidential election, and President Hugo Chavez is certainly not just a normal president of a South American country. His reach across this region is massive, and his influence in the world is growing and is significant. Nowhere more than in the Arab world, where his very clear stand on behalf of the Arabs and against American policy in the Arab region, and very strongly with the Palestinians and against their Israeli occupiers. So much rides on this election, and everybody has a point of view. I have one. The children playing around me here in this playground in the park of Generalissimo Francisco Miranda, one of the heroes of Venezuelan independence. Every child, every man, every woman has a point of view also. I'm out and about taking questions from local people, including local Arab Venezuelans, one of whom is with me now. Let's hear what he wants to ask. Welcome to Kalima Horra. Tell me, what would you like to say?
أنا اسمي ناجي حمود لبناني من لبنان الغربي حوش الحريمي. كوني عربي لبناني أقيم في فنزويلا، أود أن أسأل حضراتكم بخصوص الوضع القائم الآن في فنزويلا. هو سؤالي في حال أو ماذا تتوقعون حضراتكم بعد فوز الرئيس الفنزويلي هوغو تشافيز فريا في الانتخابات؟ ماذا تتوقعون حضراتكم بالتغيير الذي سيحدث في أمريكا أو في وجهة نظر الأمريكان باتجاه فنزويلا سياسياً، وفي وجهة النظر الأمريكيين أيضاً بخصوص البترول؟ والجميع يعلم لطالما كان الهدف الأساسي الأمريكي هو البترول. وهنا نتذكر كلمة الرئيس أوباما حينما قال للرئيس السابق بوش: أنت تبحث عن حروب بعيدة المدى بغية الحصول على البترول، وها هو البترول على بعد خطوتين، وهو كان يقصد فنزويلا.
Well, it's a very good question, Naji, and it calls into question the whole issue of the relationship between the United States and Venezuela, who are relatively near neighbors and should have friendly relations. They should have trade relations. And indeed, for a very long time, Venezuela sold most of its oil to the United States, and the United States got most of its oil from Venezuela. And there was no reason why that could not continue to be the case. The problem is the United States wanted to have a sweetheart arrangement with Venezuela so that they had favorable prices for the purchase of oil at prices which were vastly below the international price. Now, Venezuela is a sovereign and independent country, albeit one within the American continent that would prefer to have good trade relations with the most powerful of the American countries, the United States. But there was a long time where the United States was expecting Venezuelan oil for peanuts, for pennies, cents, and that could not continue because that would be an affront to Venezuelans' national independence and sovereignty, as well as impoverishing the public here in Venezuela. So President Chavez's view is clear. He's happy to sell oil to the United States, but it has to be at the international price. There cannot be any dramatic reduction for the United States, especially when the stand of the United States government and the United States media has been almost unremittingly hostile to the 14 years of President Chavez's rule. You can't routinely describe and act as if Venezuela was some kind of dictatorship and then expect them to give you oil cheap. This is completely ridiculous. But this is part of a bigger question. The United States has to realize that it does not own its backyard. The Monroe Doctrine, whereby Latin America was the United States' backyard. Latin America is nobody's backyard. Latin America is Latin America's front yard. This great population of booming economies cannot be described as anybody's backyard. So the United States has to begin to treat Latin America with respect, and it has to treat Venezuela with respect. President Chavez is a democratically elected political leader, and he has to be treated as one. And if, as I expect, he is re-elected for another 6 years as the president of Venezuela, then whoever is the next United States president, whether it is President Obama or perhaps more sharply this will come into focus if it is President Romney, then if they want to have good relations with Latin America, they'll have to treat the presidents and the people of Latin America with respect. President Obama, you can see it on YouTube, when Romney first began to talk about Venezuela in this presidential election campaign, said, "Can anyone give me any evidence that Venezuela is in any way a menace to America's national security?" That's what he was saying then, back some months ago. But Romney has continued to raise hostile and insulting questions about Venezuela throughout the campaign. And President Obama has had to move tack towards more hostile rhetoric against Venezuela. I hope that that's not a sign of things to come. If President Obama is re-elected, he has no need to make more problems with Venezuela. He already has enough problems elsewhere in the world. And if President Romney, God forbid, should come to pass, then he ought to know that the United States is already in deep trouble around the world because of its insistence on treating other people as if they were vassal states. You know, Donald Rumsfeld, the defense secretary under George W. Bush, said something so ridiculous it's almost impossible to believe that he said it, but he did say it. Donald Rumsfeld said, and I'm quoting him, he said, "It's not America's fault that God put America's oil under other people's countries." He actually said that, and he actually believes that. God didn't put America's oil under other people's countries. God put other people's oil under their countries. And the oil business, like any other business, is buying and selling. President Chavez doesn't want to drink this oil. He wants to sell it. But he wants to sell it at the best price that he can obtain for the people of Venezuela and for his project of Latin American unity and Latin American development. And the United States is just going to have to live with that manifestation of Venezuelan independence and sovereignty. Now, you ask, about the situation in the Arab world vis-a-vis Turkey. The situation is grave. Turkey is a NATO member. Turkey is a military ally of Israel. That didn't change, by the way. However big the mandate Prime Minister Erdogan achieved, he never broke his military alliance with Israel. He has political and diplomatic relations with Israel, and he's a member state of NATO, the war alliance led by the United States of America. Turkey occupied Syria for 400 years and occupied virtually all of the Arab world for 400 years. And I don't think the Arabs are ready again to live under Turkish domination, Turkish occupation. At least I hope not, though some may be prepared to do so. After all, they're happy enough, some of them, to live under American occupation and domination. But this exchange of fire, which is now several days old, between Turkey and Syria, and these emergency meetings that are taking place amongst the NATO leadership, are pregnant with terrible problems. Because if Turkey enters Syria, it will enter a swamp, it will enter a quagmire out of which it will find it very difficult to withdraw. Syria is not Libya. It's not a question of knocking out a dictator and then you can reshape the landscape, although they don't seem to be doing a terribly good job about that. If you enter Syria, you have to be ready to fight. You have to be ready to fight against the religious minorities, the ethnic minorities, the supporters of the Syrian regime. You have to be ready to face and confront Syria's international allies, Russia, China, Iran, and its local allies, the national resistance movement in Lebanon, Hezbollah. Turkey will have to fight them all one way or another, either militarily or by proxy. Is Turkey really ready for that? I doubt that. If you look at the vote in the Turkish parliament, there was a very significant minority of Turkish MPs who were against Turkey going effectively into military operations against Syria. Inside the Turkish military, which contains many elements that are not friendly to Erdogan at all, there is considerable resistance to a war with Syria amongst the Turkish military. The Kurdish problem in Turkey is a very considerable problem. They have their hands already full with this Kurdish question. Do they want to add a new war to the Kurdish war? I think that's a very serious mistake, not least because there's one ally I didn't mention of Syria, and that is the new power in Iraq. The new power in Iraq is not a part of this alliance against Syria. And what will be the impact on the Kurdish question in the north of Iraq if Turkey is at war with Syria? You begin to see the terrifying complexity of all of this. I myself do not believe either that NATO will invade Syria or that Turkey will invade Syria. I think it's important that we cool down what was an accidental exchange of fire in the first place. Syria did not intend, I'm sure, unless they completely lost their mind, to land shells on a Turkish village and kill people in Turkey. It has enough problems of its own. It was an accident. And the irony is, Syria is now being lectured that it must respect the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Turkey. What about Turkey respecting the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Syria? Turkey is a base camp for an armed insurrection against Syria, its neighbor. Yet the United Nations is allowing that whilst condemning Syria for not respecting the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Turkey. It's ridiculous. Each country should respect the territorial integrity of each other and the sovereignty of each other. As long as one side is routinely violating the sovereignty and integrity of Syria, what is Syria supposed to do? So it's time to cool this down. It's time for the Arabs to call a halt to this war in Syria and to facilitate the Kofi Annan plan, which is still extant and which remains the only peaceful way that this matter can be resolved. A peaceful transition to democracy in Syria without foreign intervention and without extremism being imported into Syria, a land of 23 or 25 different religious and ethnic sects and nationalities. That's a very, very explosive mixture, and people shouldn't casually throw fire on top of that mixture. Thank you very much. Nyaji, let me thank you for your questions, but I've got a big queue of people waiting to talk to me now on Kalima Horra on Al-Mayadeen. Thank you very much indeed. Shukran Habib. Hi, welcome to Kalima Horra. What would you like to ask me? Give me your name first.
مساء الأسمر من لبنان. بدي أسألك سؤال، إذا في حال ربح الرئيس أو خسر شو معقول يأثر علينا نحن كعرب هون فنزويلا؟ لأنه كل العالم بتعرف إنه كابريلي هو عم بيأيدوا اليهود هون. شو معقول يصير معنا العرب إذا في حال خسر الرئيس هون على الانتخابات هلا اللي عم بتصير؟
Well, this is the reason why we're here, because this election matters to the Arabs. It matters, of course, first and foremost to the Venezuelans. It matters secondarily to the people of the Americas, whom Chavez has been trying to unite and to make truly independent and truly sovereign. But of course it matters a lot to the Arabs. Chavez, for 14 years, has stood with the Arabs. He stood against American policy in the Arab world, stood against Israeli policy in the Arab world, he stood beside the Palestinians. He was the only Arab friend during the attack on Gaza in Operation Cast Lead, who expelled the Israeli ambassador from his capital. He's offered any Palestinian in the world who wants to come to Venezuela citizenship, which is something that very few of the Arab governments would have been prepared to do. And Capriles, of course, has tilted in the opposite direction. He is open. He's a supporter of Israel. He's a supporter of the United States. And the United States and Israel is supporting him. Capriles, his opponent, has very close relations with Israel and with pro-Israel elements in this region and indeed elsewhere. So the Arabs have a vital interest in the outcome of this election tomorrow. Some people say it's going to be close. Some people say, the polls say, that President Chavez is going to win quite comfortably. We'll see in just a few hours what the outcome is. But one thing's for sure, the friends of the Arabs must want a Chavez victory. The enemies of the Arabs definitely want a Capriles victory. That's the long and the short of it. Good question. Thanks very much for coming on Kalima Horra. Sorry, I've got a lot of people to talk to. Thanks so much. Assalamu alaikum. What's your name and what would you like to ask on Kalima Horra here in Caracas, Venezuela?
Thank you. I'm Michel from Lebanon. بدي أسألك عندي سؤال هيك على طول كان شغل لي بالي. نحن بنعرف إنه بالشرق في أزمة وممكن تتطور لمشاكل، وهالشيء رح يأثر على منابع البترول بكل الشرق الأوسط، وبنعتقد إنه المنبع الوحيد للبترول رح يضل بفنزويلا. فالانتخابات اللي عم نعيشها نحن اليوم بفنزويلا ممكن تأثر سلبيا أو إيجابيا بالنسبة للبترول العالمي. فقديش حضرتك بتعتقد إنه العملية الانتخابية اليوم عم بيديروها القوى الكبيرة مشان يقدروا يسيطروا على منابع البترول في حال صار مسار بالشرق الأوسط؟
Well, that's a very intelligent and sophisticated question. And I must say I hadn't actually given that matter any thought. But my initial reaction is that you could very well be right. Because clearly if there is an American attack on Iran, Iran's production will collapse. The Iranian retaliation will close the Straits of Hormuz. The Arab allies of the United States will be attacked and their production will fall. There will be a massive increase in the price of oil on the international markets, a massive reduction in supply. And Venezuela is one of the great petroleum exporters on the earth. And there's a history in this because in the Second World War, it was Venezuelan oil which fueled the American war effort. If not for Venezuelan oil, America would not have been able to fight the Second World War. And clearly, if President Chavez remains in power here in Venezuela, then America doesn't have an ally, it has an opponent in power. If Capriles is the president here, it will have an ally, maybe even a puppet in power in Venezuela. And they can dictate to Venezuela how much production and what price, as they used to do before. Look, I stress, President Chavez wants to sell oil to the United States, but he wants the proper price for that oil because he's running Venezuela in the interest of Venezuela, not in the interest of either oil companies or the United States, so that they can sell their gasoline cheap to their own people. You know, Donald Rumsfeld once said that it's not our fault that God put America's oil under other people's countries. I know it's funny, it's like a joke, but he really, yeah, Rumsfeld really did say that, and he believes it, that it's unfortunate that God put America's oil under other people's countries. Well, that's of course not true. God put other people's oil under their own countries. And if you want to buy it, you have to buy it at the price that is established in the international market. But clearly, God forbid that the United States or Israel, which is the same thing, attacks Iran in the early part of next year, then clearly Venezuelans' oil as a swing producer could become a very significant and important issue indeed. Michelle, thanks. You made me think. All the best to you. Thanks so much. Hi there. What's your name? What would you like to ask me on Kalima Horra?
Hola, mi nombre es Marjorie Silva, soy publicista y vivo en Caracas, Venezuela. Quisiera saber cuáles son sus expectativas de hecho a las elecciones venezolanas y qué lo motivó de venir como observador internacional.
Well, actually, there's an enormous amount of international interest in the outcome of this election because President Hugo Chavez is not just an ordinary man, and Venezuela's election is not just an ordinary election. People have come from all over the world of all different kinds and for all different reasons, but they're all interested. I'm interested on two levels. Mayadeen television is an Arabic language television speaking to the Arabic speaking world, and the Arabs have a vital interest in the outcome of this election because Chavez has stood with the Arab people against the United States domination and stood with the Palestinian people against the Israeli occupation of their land and their dispersal around the globe. Indeed, President Chavez offered all Palestinians the right to come and be citizens here in Venezuela, which is something that no Arab ruler could easily or would easily do. Chavez expelled the Israeli ambassador from Caracas when Israel attacked Gaza in the Operation Cast Lead. So I'm interested obviously on that level, but I'm interested on another level. I'm a politician of the left. I believe that the poor have a right to eat, the poor have a right to be educated, the poor have a right to health, the poor have a right to live and have a fair share of the fruits of their country's production. And until Hugo Chavez, the poor in Venezuela had nothing. Most went to bed hungry at night, and they gained virtually nothing from the fact that Venezuela is this great oil exporter to the world. The oligarchy that used to rule here ruled in the interests of the United States and its interests, not in the interests of the people of Venezuela. So I have watched with great admiration how Chavez has transformed the landscape here. And I pray to God that this experiment is not cut short when he's still strong and still has so much work to do. But there are others. All the journalists are here because this is a big battle between the left and the right, between the United States and its allies and those who stand up against the United States domination of the world. Everyone is interested in that outcome. Some will be with one side, others will be with Chavez. I'm definitely with Chavez. But thanks, Marjorie, for that question. Welcome to Kalima Horra on Mayadeen TV. Thank you. Well, I'm attracting quite a crowd here in Caracas, Venezuela. There's a big line of people with many questions still to ask. And God willing, I'll be here to answer them after the break. Welcome back to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, for Mayadeen television here in Caracas, Venezuela, on the eve of an absolutely portentous presidential election vote, which begins at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. Welcome, sir. What would you like to ask me on Kalima Horra?
Bienvenido a Venezuela. Mi nombre es Luis Abunde, comerciante aquí en Caracas, Venezuela, y yo quiero hacerle una pregunta. Ya la oposición 24 horas antes de las elecciones está cantando fraude. ¿Qué opinión tiene usted sobre eso? Porque ellos hace tiempo están atacando al órgano, atacando al árbitro. ¿Y qué le parece a usted esa guerra no solo nacional mediática como internacional atacando al árbitro electoral?
Well, look, I think the Venezuelan opposition has a confused position on all this, because only a few hours ago they were telling us they were extremely confident that they were going to win the presidential election. A few hours later, they're telling us that there's going to be massive electoral fraud. The truth is that neither of these two propositions is likely to be true. It's often the case in elections that the party which realizes that it has not done enough to win, maybe it's made some gains, some advance, but not done enough to win, takes recourse in this claim of electoral fraud. All I can say is I've seen absolutely no evidence of any malfeasance in the election at all. On the contrary, there's an excess of democracy here in Venezuela. The private television companies, the private newspapers, private interests are all firing big guns on behalf of Capriles, the opposition leader. The United States is landing its ammunition, electorally speaking, on Venezuela to try to influence the result. The marches of the opposition, the meetings of the opposition have been big and considerable, and nobody has interfered with them. And the computerized election machinery which will be used tomorrow in the election is tried and tested in Venezuela. It's been used for the last 6 years in all the votes in elections and referenda. And people understand it now. And the CNE on the opposition Global Vision television channel just last night was being complimented wholesomely, fulsomely by the opposition journalists. So it's a bit late to say that there's electoral fraud going to happen. It seems to me likely that this is a kind of insurance policy to give themselves something to say when, as I expect, President Chavez wins a decent-sized victory in the elections tomorrow. Jimmy Carter's center was very clear. The process in Venezuela is clear and transparent and free and fair. And if it's good enough for Jimmy Carter, it's good enough for me. Thanks very much, Luis, for coming on Kalima Horra. Thank you. Thanks so much. Assalamu alaikum.
عليكم السلام.
Give me your name and your question, please.
محمد عبيد، أنا من جنوب لبنان. السؤال إنه اليوم نحن بنشوف ما عاد في أي دولة بالعالم تقدر تاخذ قرارها وعندها استقلالية، بالعكس صار في دول مهيمنة على كثير من الدول من العالم. فاليوم صار عندنا فريقين، إنه الفريق الأمريكاني الإسرائيلي مع حلفائه. من ميل تاني عندنا الفريق الروسي الصيني الإيراني كمان لهم حلفائهم. هلا هون بنلاقي انه الفريق الاول اللي هو امريكا واسرائيل كانوا دائما طمعانين بكثير من الدول، باحتلالها، بتشريد اهلها، بقتل الابرياء، بطمع بترول، باي شيء، بثروات البلد من مي من غيره. بينما الفريق الثاني ما شفنا يوم لا احتل اي دوله ولا طمع باي شيء، بالعكس. بقى هون نحن كمان الدول الأوروبية ما عم نشوفها عم تتحرك مثل بريطانيا من فرنسا لألمانيا لغيره، تلاقي ما إلها دور، بالعكس عم ينهار اقتصادها شوي شوي وهي مش حاسة. الأمريكان صادرين لهم قرارهم، صادرين لهم كلمتهم، ما عم يقدروا يتحركوا. فنحن بنتمنى منهم إنه يصير في إعادة نظر ويشوفوا وين الطريق الصح ويتجهوا فيها.
Well, the world is divided and on entirely different lines to the division that existed before. In the Cold War, we had East versus West, the communist world, the non-communist world, with a battle for the hearts and minds of the people in the middle, the so-called third world, non-aligned countries. Now there's a new division. It is America and Israel and its allies, both Western allies and Eastern allies, and the countries that you mentioned. China, which will soon be the most powerful country in the world. Russia, which is recovering its strength and its dignity after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the depredations of the Boris Yeltsin years. The new leadership of Russia is slowly building Russia's strength again and asserting its foreign policy priorities in the world. And Iran, of course, is a major and important country in confrontation with this American-Israeli axis. And there are others, countries like Brazil, countries like Venezuela, who are powerful and important countries. South Africa is another one. India from time to time, another one. They are standing up against the idea that the United States can just rule the world as it pleases. The truth is, Russia and China and Iran and Brazil and South Africa and India and Venezuela, they're not invading or occupying anybody. They're trying to build their own countries. But the United States has invaded and occupied more than 50 countries in the last 50 years and killed millions upon millions of people. 3 or 4 millions in Vietnam, 2 millions in Cambodia. They've killed people all over the world in the name of democracy, in the name of liberty and freedom. They've killed and destroyed. So for me, I know which side I'm on in this division. Now you ask me, where does Europe fit into this? Countries like France and Britain. Well, Britain and France are dripping in the blood of people from their own empire past. Before the Americans were slaughtering the Vietnamese, the French were slaughtering them. The British had an empire so vast that upon it the sun never set, because God would never trust the English in the dark. Britain went around the world, occupying other people's countries and stealing their things. Now France and Britain, neither of them, even together, is strong enough to invade and occupy other people's countries. And if I don't have a duty as a British person to say that, who has that duty? The good news is there are millions and millions of people in Britain and in Europe who reject the idea of their countries being empires again, of their countries being attack dogs for the big empire of the United States, and who stand in solidarity with the victims of that big power aggression, that imperial aggression. And I don't think that's going to change. That's why Venezuela is so important, because it shows that another way is possible. It shows that independence, sovereignty, standing up to the United States, opposing Zionism, backing the victims of imperialism, and supporting Latin American unity and independence can work and can be popular, and millions of people can be moved onto the streets and into the ballot stations in order to support it. And I pray to God in these last few hours, that Chavez is re-elected for another 6 years. Anyway, thanks for coming on Kalima Horra. It's been great to talk to you. Shukran كثير. Welcome to Kalima Horra, Senora. Thank you very much for coming on our television program. And I think you've got a good question for me. I hope so.
Bueno, encantada. Bienvenido a Venezuela. Mi nombre es Isabel Padilla. Yo soy actriz. Bueno, primero me gustaría saber si usted está enterado de cuál es la situación en Venezuela. ¿Cuál es la situación en Venezuela con el gobierno del presidente Hugo Chávez? Yo soy opositora. Yo jamás voté por el señor Hugo Chávez. O sea, yo no soy lo que llaman aquí en Venezuela chavista arrepentida, esos que votaron en el 98 y luego se arrepintieron. No, yo jamás creí en él, porque desde que él asomó su cara el 4 de febrero, yo nunca creí en él. Y el tiempo me ha dado la razón, porque es una persona sumamente falsa y mentirosa. Hugo Chávez tiene 14 años en el poder y en 14 años jamás ha podido resolver los principales problemas del país o del pueblo venezolano, que son la inseguridad. En Venezuela hay miles de muertos todos los años y son ocasionados por la falta de voluntad del gobierno de una política de seguridad efectiva. Parece que al gobierno le conviene mucho la inseguridad porque es como una política de Estado. Segundo, la inflación. Aquí el costo de la vida es altísimo, a las personas no le alcanza el dinero para comer. Y después la corrupción espantosa de todas las personas que rodean al presidente Chávez, a su entorno más cercano y más íntimo, que han robado a manos llenas. Entonces, en 14 años de gobierno del presidente Chávez, cada día hay más opositores. Él jamás en 14 años ha podido convencer al pueblo venezolano. Y eso es algo que nosotros nos preguntamos. ¿Por qué después de 14 años cada día hay más opositores? ¿Por qué el gobierno del presidente Chávez no ha podido convencer a la oposición venezolana? Y por eso es, como es un gobierno que no ha dado resultados, que queremos cambiarlo por un gobierno más efectivo, más decente y que encamine a este país hacia la senda del progreso y de la seguridad.
Well, thank you for the frankness of your question. It was very candid and you left nobody in any doubt as to where you stand. For me, this is an indication that this is a free election, that people are free to march for the opposition, as they did in very large numbers. They are free to hold rallies and meetings of all kinds. The opposition has many television stations and many newspapers and many radio stations, and you are not afraid at all here in Caracas, Venezuela, on the eve of the election, to be absolutely blunt in your condemnation of President Hugo Chavez. I take a different point of view. Let me deal with the issues that you raised. First of all, security. How secure is Venezuela? Is it as secure as Colombia? Is it as secure as Miami? Is it as secure as Los Angeles? It's much more secure. It's much more secure than these places that I have mentioned. And of course there is crime in Venezuela. There is crime in every country in the world. And the reality is that the criminals are not hoping for a Hugo Chavez victory tomorrow. Believe me. So crime is an issue here, and you've raised it as the #1 issue, in fact, in this election. But it's not exclusively a Venezuelan problem, and I believe it's being politicized and exaggerated by the opposition here in Venezuela and its Western allies in Fox News and in the United States and across the Western world. The second issue you raised about the economy, I just don't recognize at all. Venezuela's economy is booming. Your growth rate was 5.6% in the first 6 months of this year. This is a bigger growth rate than China. You are one of the fastest growing economies in the entire world. And it's clear where the money is going. Now the problem is, many people don't like where the money is going. Some people don't like the money being spent in the barrios. Some people don't like the money being spent on educating poor people, on feeding poor people, on improving the health of poor people. Some people believe that the rich should keep the money they used to keep in Venezuela before Hugo Chavez's time. The economy here is the envy of most countries in the world. Your growth rate is 5.6% in the first 6 months. Our growth rate is minus 2% in Britain. So please don't imagine that your economic problems are anything like comparable to the economic problems in most parts of the world. Now, when it comes to the division of the wealth, there is always an argument. There's always an argument in favor of private expenditure and public expenditure. There's always an argument in money going into individuals' pockets and an argument in favor of building, for example, 22 new universities in 14 years. In 98% of the Venezuelans now eating 3 meals per day, and the other 2% eating 2 meals per day. There's an argument for giving teeth to poor people who couldn't afford them, giving cataract operations to poor people that couldn't afford them. There's an argument in favor, you can come back, we want you to argue with me, but let me speak first. There's an argument in favor of public versus private. Now my last point is this, on corruption. If you think corruption is either an exclusively Venezuelan affair, you never visited the United States, or you never visited Britain, or you never visited Colombia, or you never visited Brazil. There is corruption everywhere in the world. And the idea that Hugo Chavez is responsible for the corruption, was Venezuela corruption free before Chavez? Did the old political system before Chavez, was there no corruption? This is a ridiculous idea. And secondly, this corruption, whilst real, is something that has to be confronted by all the people. It has to be confronted by all the people. There should be a consensus in the country against corruption. Now, are you saying that Hugo Chavez is corrupt? What did he do? Where did he steal? What did he do? Where is his money? Where did he put his money? Tell me then. Tell me where Hugo Chavez's money is. Where did he put his money?
Él es el padre de la corrupción. Él es el padre.
His father?
Él es el padre de la corrupción.
He's the father of corruption.
Ajá, sí.
You tell me. Tell the viewers. Tell the viewers where Hugo Chavez put his corruption.
Le voy a decir algo. A mí no me importa lo que pasa en China, ni lo que pasa en Colombia, ni lo que pasa en Miami, ni lo que pasa en Estados Unidos. A mí me importa lo que pasa en Venezuela. A mí me importa la corrupción en Venezuela. No me ponga ejemplos de otros países. Y le voy a decir una cosa. Aquí se podrá hablar, como dice usted, que aquí hay libertad. Hay libertad para hablar. Pero el señor Hugo Chávez utiliza los tribunales para castigar a sus opositores, para mandarle a meter 30 años de prisión si no están de acuerdo con él. Quiero que lo sepa. Entonces, aquí solamente hay libertad para hablar, no hay libertad para ninguna otra cosa. ¿Entiende? Y el señor Hugo Chávez es el padre de la corrupción. Él alcahuetea.
I'm asking you on camera, where is Hugo Chavez's money? Where's the money he stole?
Él alcahuetea a los corruptos de su gobierno.
Where is the money? Please translate. Where is Hugo Chavez's corruption? Where's his money? Where is his money? Where is his money?
¿De quién?
Where is it? Is it in Miami?
No la necesita porque tiene todo. Un presidente no necesita dinero porque tiene todo, no necesita gastar nada. Pero le voy a decir una cosa, el señor Hugo Chávez, él es cómplice y alcahuetea a su entorno más cercano para que roben, ¿entiende? Y utiliza los tribunales de justicia para fregar a las personas que no están de acuerdo con el régimen. Utiliza los tribunales de justicia. Aquí lo único que hay es libertad para hablar y nada más, porque ponen presa a la gente, alcahuetea a los corruptos y la inseguridad es una política de Estado porque le conviene que hayan bastante malandros en la calle para que las personas decentes tengan que estar encerradas en su casa y no salgan a la calle.
Okay, I just want to make this clear. This is supposedly a dictatorship. We have here a famous actress denouncing as the father of corruption the president of the country.
De todos modos no me va a pasar nada porque a partir de mañana el nuevo presidente va a ser Enrique Capriles ¿entiende? Va a ser, y entonces Hugo Chávez no va a tener poder para volver a poner preso a nadie.
Okay. Let me speak. This is supposedly a dictatorship. We have a woman, a famous actress, denouncing the president of the country here right in the center of Caracas. We had 200,000 people just a few days ago demonstrating in support of the election campaign of Capriles, the opposition candidate for president. He's had, hold on, I'm speaking. He's had rallies, look, we can't both speak at the same time. We can't both speak at the same time. There are dozens of opposition television stations, radio stations, newspapers, with all the support from Miami and from the United States of America, all on one side. Now, I want to address this question of corruption. The oligarchy, of which our famous actress undoubtedly is a supporter, the oligarchy were the biggest thieves, the biggest corruptors that Venezuela ever had. Hugo Chavez was a simple soldier with nothing except the uniform on his back. For 14 years, he has drawn the salary of the President of the Republic. He has no money. He has no bank account. He has no bank account in Miami. He has no bank account in New York. I know, because Hugo Chavez, if he had a bank account in Miami, these people would be giving us the number and telling us how much money was in it. These people in Iran, anybody that put their money in a bank in Iran would have to be crazy. Money in Iran is disappearing down the plug hole. Chavez, whatever else he is not corrupt. Chavez might have made mistakes. There might be corruption in Venezuela, but Chavez, like Castro, has never stolen 1 cent from the people of Venezuela. The real thieves, the real crooks are the oligarchy who ruled here before, and if she has her way, will rule here again tomorrow. Senora, you're a very good actress. You're a very good actress. You're a very good actress. This has been George Galloway in a very special edition of Kalima Horra for Mayadeen TV, right here in the center of a free and fair election where everyone can have their say, where every word has the right to be free. Assalamu alaikum.